"Please, just make it quick," she whispered, but the rancher's response shocked everyone. A snowstorm howls across the frontier. A desperate widow falls to her knees on a ranch porch, ready to be cast aside, or worse. But instead of turning her away, the rancher lifts her up and sets the whole valley on fire. Church bells toll. Deputies rattle their keys. Hooves thunder down a frozen street. Because she's not just another widow, she holds a secret deed to the town's water, a deed the railroad will kill to take. The law says she must be handed over. The syndicate says the ranch will burn if he defends her. But the rancher stands tall, declaring she stays. Now the town is split. Neighbors whisper. A preacher digs up hidden treaties. And the sheriff, he's already been bought. When faith, land, and survival clash under winter skies, who will this town follow? The railroad's might, or a widow's whispered plea? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind howled across the Colorado plains as dawn's weak light struggled through heavy clouds. Inside his ranch house, Dale McCord stirred from another restless night. 20 years of working this land had taught him to rise before the sun, but this morning felt different. The air carried an extra bite, and the windows rattled with each gust of the brewing snowstorm. He pulled on his worn boots and thick wool coat, movements automatic after so many years alone. The empty house echoed with his footsteps, a sound that had grown familiar since Sarah's passing 3 winters ago. Dale paused at the shelf where her Bible still sat, collecting dust. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. The ranch hands would be in the bunkhouse, waiting out the storm. Dale knew he should check the fence lines himself. Storms like this could trap cattle in drifts. He opened his heavy wooden door, the hinges protesting against the cold. That's when he saw her. A woman knelt in the snow, her thin shawl offering little protection against the bitter cold. Her dark hair whipped in the wind, and her dress, once fine but now worn, was dusted with snow. She looked up at him with eyes full of desperation, her lips blue from cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying above the wind. "Just make it quick." Dale's heart clenched at the words. He'd seen that look before, in wounded animals, in men who'd lost everything. It was the look of someone who'd given up hope. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with frozen wings. As he carried her inside, he glimpsed movement at the bunkhouse, his ranch hands watching, their faces dark with suspicion. Inside, Dale set her gently in his old leather chair by the fireplace. The woman's eyes darted around the room as if searching for escape routes, but her body trembled too much to move. "Name's Dale McCord," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He stirred the embers and added fresh logs until flames licked upward. "Susan," she managed through chattering teeth. "Susan Avery." Dale moved to the kitchen, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He ladled yesterday's soup into a pot and set it on the stove to warm. When he returned with a wool blanket, Susan had drawn her knees to her chest, making herself smaller. "Ma'am," Dale said softly, holding out the blanket. "Reckon you've got a story to tell, but first, you need to warm up." Susan took the blanket, with shaking hands wrapping it tight around her shoulders. "Why?" she whispered. "Why help me?" "You don't know what I've done." Dale pulled up his old wooden rocker, its familiar creak filling the silence. "Don't need to know right now. Soup's warming." Tears filled Susan's eyes, but she blinked them back. "My husband," she began, her voice strengthening slightly. "Thomas, he had a weakness for cards. I didn't know how bad until after he passed. To the railroad syndicate, they bought his debts." Dale's jaw tightened. He'd heard about the syndicates. Methods buying up debts, forcing people off their land for the coming railroad. Their agents dressed in fine suits and spoke with smooth voices, but their hearts were cold as the storm outside. "They came yesterday," Susan continued, her hands clutching the blanket. "Said I had until sunset to clear out, but I had nowhere to go. They followed me when I ran." She looked up at Dale, her eyes haunted. "I've been walking all night." The soup began to bubble on the stove. Dale rose and poured it into his wife's old china bowl, the one he hadn't used since she died. He handed it to Susan, who wrapped her fingers around its warmth. "Careful now," he said. "Take it slow." Susan sipped the soup carefully, color gradually returning to her cheeks. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the fire crackled steadily. Dale watched as she ate, noting how she tried to maintain proper manners despite her desperate hunger. It spoke of better days, of a life lived with dignity before fate turned cruel. A knock at the door made Susan flinch, spilling a few drops of soup. Dale rose, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He opened the door to find Jake, his foreman, standing there with snow coating his hat brim. "Mr. McCord," Jake said, his voice low. "Boys are wondering about our guest." Dale stepped onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. The wind cut through his coat, but he stood firm. "She stays." "Sir, we don't know her story. Could be trouble following her. Railroad men don't take kindly to interference," noted. Dale's tone made it clear the discussion was over. Jake shifted his weight, snow crunching under his boots. "Just looking out for the ranch, sir." "For you?" Dale's expression softened slightly. "Much obliged, Jake, but she stays." Back inside, Dale found Susan had set the empty bowl aside. She'd settled onto the hearthrug, closer to the fire's warmth, but her eyes were wary as he returned. "Your men don't want me here," she said softly. "I heard them yesterday, before I ran. They said the same about me then, that I bring trouble." She started to rise. "I should go." "No." Dale's voice was quiet but firm. "Storm's getting worse. Besides, any trouble coming will come whether you're here or not." Susan sank back down, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "I don't understand," she whispered. When I knelt there in the snow, I thought she couldn't finish the thought. Dale understood what she couldn't say. She'd expected him to chase her off, maybe worse. The thought that someone could be driven to such despair made his chest ache with an unfamiliar pain. Through the window, he could see his ranch hands returning to the bunkhouse, their backs bent against the wind. They were good men, but fear made people wary of involvement. Dale remembered how the town had whispered when Sarah fell ill. How folks had slowly stopped visiting, afraid that grief might be catching. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Susan's eyes had grown heavy, the warmth and food working against her exhaustion. Dale watched as she fought to stay awake, her head nodding forward, then jerking up again. "Rest," he said gently. "No one's going to harm you here." Susan looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, truth, perhaps, or deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her. Because she finally allowed her eyes to close, Dale settled back in his rocker, its familiar motion soothing. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, but inside, something had changed. The house felt different, less empty, somehow. He glanced at Sarah's Bible on the shelf, remembering how she'd always said the Lord worked in mysterious ways. As Susan slept by the hearth, Dale kept watch, listening to the wind's moan and the subtle murmur of voices from the bunkhouse. He knew questions would need answering, decisions would need making. But for now, in this moment, he'd done what needed doing. Sometimes, he reckoned, that was enough. The morning light struggled through the storm clouds, casting weak shadows across the floor. Dale McCord, who'd spent so many years building walls around his solitude, found himself considering how quickly those walls could crumble with just one act of mercy. Just one person in need of shelter from the storm. The winter sun had climbed to its highest point when Susan stirred from her place by the hearth. The rich aroma of coffee filled the ranch house, mixing with the lingering scent of wood smoke. Her eyes fluttered open, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings until memory rushed back. Dale stood at the iron stove, his movements quiet and measured as he poured 2 cups of coffee. He'd let her sleep through the morning, something she couldn't remember doing since Thomas died. The thought of her late husband sent a familiar ache through her chest. "Thought you might need this," Dale said, offering her a steaming cup. The coffee was strong and black, but Susan welcomed its bitter warmth. "Thank you," she murmured, sitting up straighter on the hearthrug. "I've imposed on your kindness far too long already." Dale didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed to an old cedar chest in the corner. Susan watched as he lifted the lid with careful reverence, removing something wrapped in brown paper. He returned and held it out to her. "Sarah's quilt," he said simply. "My wife's weather's turning colder." Susan's hands trembled as she took the bundle. The paper crackled as she unwrapped it, revealing a masterwork of quilting, intricate patterns in faded blues and creams, every stitch speaking of patience and love. "Oh no," she protested. "I couldn't possibly. She would have wanted it used," Dale cut in, his voice gruff but gentle. "No good letting it gather dust." Through the window, Susan could see ranch hands moving between the barn and bunkhouse. Their glances toward the house weren't exactly hostile, but she recognized the wariness in their stance. One man, the foreman, who'd come to the door last night, spoke in low tones to his fellows, shaking his head. "Your men are worried," she said softly, drawing the quilt around her shoulders despite her protests. "About me bringing trouble to your door." Dale took a long drink of his coffee before answering. "Men worry about what they can't control. Nature of things out here." The day passed slowly. Susan tried to make herself useful, washing the breakfast dishes and sweeping the wooden floors, though Dale insisted she rest. By late afternoon, savory smells wafted from the kitchen where Dale prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. As they sat down to eat, Susan couldn't help but notice how naturally Dale set to places at the table as if he hadn't spent years dining alone. The cornbread was a little dark around the edges, but warm and filling. "I should go after supper," Susan said, breaking a long silence. "I've already stayed too long, and the railroad men's storm's not done." Dale interrupted, nodding toward the window where snow still swirled. "Roads'll be treacherous after dark. But the danger I'm bringing to your door ain't the first. Danger these walls have seen." Dale's tone was final as he pushed the cornbread toward her. "Take another piece." The kitchen's warmth and the heavy meal made Susan drowsy again, her body still recovering from her night in the cold. The routine of washing up the supper dishes felt almost normal, as if she belonged here in this quiet house with its stoic owner. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats shattered the evening peace. Dale moved to the window, its expression hardening. "Deputy," he said quietly. Susan's heart began to race. She knew what this meant. The railroad syndicate working through official channels now. Her fingers clutched the edge of Sarah's quilt where it still draped her shoulders. Heavy boots stomped onto the porch, followed by a sharp rap at the door. Dale opened it to reveal Deputy Cormac, snow dusting his dark uniform, his badge catching the lamplight. "Evening, McCord," Cormac said, his friendly tone at odds with his cold eyes. "Got business here." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Legal writ regarding your guest." Susan stepped forward, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll go quietly, Deputy. No need to involve Mr. McCord." But Dale didn't move from the doorway. "What's the writ say, exactly?" Cormac's smile didn't reach his eyes as he unfolded the paper. "Miss Avery here's been declared collateral against outstanding debts." Railroad syndicates got legal right to take her into custody until matters are settled. Debts that weren't mine, Susan protested. Thomas never told me laws. The law, ma'am? Cormac cut her off. And McCord, you should know anyone interfering with this legal proceeding could find their own property subject to seizure. Railroads got broad rights these days. The threat hung in the air like frost. Susan could see Dale's ranch hands gathering at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Everything she feared, bringing destruction to those who showed her kindness, was happening. "I'll go," she whispered, moving toward the door. "Please, Mr. McCord, I won't see you lose your ranch over my troubles." But Dale didn't step aside. Instead, he squared his shoulders, drawing himself up to his full height in the doorway. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried the weight of iron. "She stays," he said, "and this ranch stands with her." Deputy Cormac's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, McCord. Big mistake. Railroad don't take kindly to folk who don't. Respect the law. Law's one thing," Dale replied evenly. "Justice is another. That writ you're holding might be legal paper, but it ain't right. And this ranch stands for what's right." Susan held her breath, watching the deputy's hand hover near his gun belt. But Cormac merely crumpled the writ, his face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this," he spat. "Both of you." He turned sharply, boots heavy on the porch steps. Horses. Hooves kicked up snow as he wheeled around and galloped away into the gathering dusk. In the silence that followed, Susan could hear her own heart pounding. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why risk everything for a stranger?" Dale turned from the door, his face softened by the lamplight. "Some things matter more than land," he said simply. "Sarah taught me that. Took me too long to remember it." Through the window, Susan saw the ranch hand slowly disperse, their movements uncertain. She knew the deputy's threat would spread through the bunkhouse tonight, adding to their fears. Yet Dale stood steady, as unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. The quilt around her shoulders felt warmer now, as if Sarah's love had been stitched into every careful seam. Susan drew it closer, watching Dale bank the fire for the night, his movements sure and practiced. Outside, the storm continued its slow dance across the valley. But here, in this moment, she felt something she hadn't known in far too long, the sturdy foundation of someone willing to stand beside her, whatever might come. The bunkhouse buzzed with hushed voices as darkness settled over the ranch. Through frosted windows, lamplight cast long shadows across weathered floorboards while ranch hands huddled around the pot-bellied stove, their concerns flowing as freely as the coffee they passed between them. "Boss is taking an awful risk," muttered Tom Jenkins, the senior hand. He'd worked the McCord Ranch going on 15 years, long enough to remember when Sarah's laughter brightened these halls. "Railroad syndicate ain't known for mercy." "Reckon it's noble, though," young Billy Peters countered, warming his hands near the stove. "Standing up for a widow against them city men. Like something from them dime novels." "Noble don't feed cattle," grumbled another hand, "or pay wages if they take the ranch." The debate continued in low tones, but no conclusion came. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the valley in white silence in the main house. Susan sat before the hearth, the flames casting a warm glow across her face. Her fingers traced the edges of a worn leather packet she'd kept hidden in the folds of her dress. Dale settled into the chair opposite her, his expression patient as he waited for her to speak. "I've been carrying these," Susan said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ever since Thomas," she swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. Dale leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Whatever it is, Mrs. Avery, you're safe here." Susan's hands trembled as she unwrapped the packet. Inside were several papers, creased and yellowed at the edges, but still clearly legible. She passed them to Dale with shaking fingers. Thomas wasn't just gambling, she said. He was. He was trying to secure our future. In his own foolish way. Dale moved closer to the lamp, holding the documents where light could better reach the careful script. His eyes widened as he read, then narrowed in concentration. "This is a deed," he said slowly, "signed by James Morton himself, chief agent of the railroad's Western Division." He looked up at Susan. "This grants water rights along Thunder Creek to Thomas Avery and his heirs. The whole stretch from Copper Mountain down through the valley." Susan nodded, twisting her hands in her lap. "Thomas paid for it with everything we had. Said it would be worth 10 times the price once the railroad came through." A bitter smile crossed her face. He was right about that much, at least. Dale continued reading, his weathered fingers careful with the fragile papers. "This is properly notarized, dated 2 years ago." He glanced at Susan. "Why didn't you come forward with this before?" Tears welled in Susan's eyes. "The day after Thomas signed the papers, 2 men visited our farm. Railroad men, though they didn't say so directly." She drew a shaky breath. "They told Thomas that if he ever tried to enforce his claim, they'd make sure no one ever found his body." Dale's jaw tightened, and after Thomas passed, they came back. Susan's voice cracked. "Said the threat still stood for his widow. I was alone, Mr. McCord. I had no one to turn to, nowhere to go. So I ran." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "I've been running ever since." Standing, Dale moved to the window. Beyond the frosted glass, snow continued to fall in thick curtains, obscuring even the nearby bunkhouse from view. "Storm's got us cut off from town till morning at least," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Gives us time to think. "I shouldn't have shown you," Susan said quickly. "Now you're in danger too. If they find out you know Mrs. Avery." Dale turned from the window, his expression firm but gentle. "My father built this ranch, knowing that sometimes a man has to stand his ground. Some things are worth the risk, but your ranch hands are good men who understand right from wrong." Dale returned to his chair, adding another log to the fire. Sparks rose up the chimney as he continued. "That deed you're holding, it's not just paper. It's the future of this valley. Water rights mean the difference between survival and ruin out here." Susan clutched the papers to her chest. "What do we do?" First Dale said, settling back into his chair. "We protect you. Then we prove your claim legal and proper through the territorial courts if need be." His voice carried quiet conviction. "I promise you this, Mrs. Avery, no railroad syndicate is going to drive you from what's rightfully yours. Not while this ranch stands." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, wind whistled through the eaves, carrying the sound of ice crystals tapping against the windows. The storm had sealed them in their own quiet world, if only for the night. Susan bowed her head, her lips moving in silent prayer. Dale rose quietly to stoke the fire, adding another log with practiced care. The flames caught and grew stronger, pushing back the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. "Lord," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible above the fire's gentle roar, "grant me courage for whatever comes." She looked up to find Dale watching her, his face softened by firelight. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, each aware of how their fates had become unexpectedly entwined. The deed lay between them on the small table, its presence as weighty as the snow that continued to blanket the valley. In the bunkhouse, the hands' voices had fallen silent, but their concerns still hung in the air like smoke. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, the storm kept the world at bay, giving them this moment of quiet preparation for whatever lay ahead. Dawn painted the snow-covered valley in shades of pearl and gold. The storm had eased overnight, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. Dale McCord stood in his barn, methodically hitching his team to the heavy wagon. His movements were practiced, efficient, born. From years of working these same routines, the crunch of boots on fresh snow announced Susan's approach. She appeared in the barn doorway, wrapped in Sarah's old wool coat, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. "The hand said you're planning to drive into town," she said, her voice carrying a mix of concern and determination. Dale nodded, checking the harness straps. "Those papers need proper reviewing. Can't let the syndicate get ahead of us on this." He glanced at her, noting how she held herself straight despite her obvious fatigue. "Road'll be rough after the storm, but we need to make our claim known." "Mr. McCord," Susan began, then hesitated. "Dale, you've already risked so much. Your ranch, your reputation, best get moving if we want to reach town by afternoon." Dale interrupted gently, extending his hand to help her into the wagon. The leather of his gloves was worn smooth from years of use. Like everything else about him, weathered but reliable. Susan accepted his help, settling onto the wooden seat as Dale arranged heavy blankets around them both. The wagon creaked. As he climbed up beside her, gathering the reins in his capable hands, they set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the horses' hooves breaking through the crusty surface of the snow. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks in the pristine white, marking their passage through the silent landscape. For a long while, they rode in comfortable quiet, the only sounds the jingling of harness and the steady breathing of the horses. Susan spoke, her voice soft but clear in the winter air. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for this morning, but for everything since yesterday. Most men would have turned me away." Dale kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his expression softened. Been too much silence at the ranch since Sarah passed. He paused, surprised at his own admission. "Reckon sometimes the Lord puts people in our path for a reason. How long has it been?" Susan asked gently. 3 years come spring." Dale adjusted the reins, guiding the team around a drift. "Started feeling like the quiet might hollow me out completely." Susan nodded, understanding in her eyes. Grief has a way of doing that, making everything echo inside until you can't bear it. The trail wound down through snow-laden pines, requiring Dale's full attention. Ice had formed beneath the fresh snow, making the going treacherous. Several times the wagon slid sideways before Dale's skilled handling brought them back to safer ground by mid-afternoon. They crested the final rise above town. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight columns, and the street showed signs of life despite the weather. Dale guided the team carefully down the main street, where townsfolk hurried between buildings. Collars turned up against the cold. The general store's windows glowed warmly as they passed. Inside, clusters of people gathered, their animated discussions visible through frosted panes. Susan caught fragments of conversation about water rights and railroad claims as they drove by. "News travels fast," Dale observed grimly, pulling the wagon to a stop outside the sheriff's office. The building stood square and official, its weathered boards and tin star speaking of law and order. Dale helped Susan down, noting how she straightened her spine and lifted her chin before climbing the wooden steps. Inside, Sheriff Braddock sat behind his desk, a man gone soft around the middle but with eyes that missed nothing. He looked up as they entered, his expression carefully neutral. "McCord," he acknowledged, then turned his attention to Susan. "Mrs. Avery, heard you'd found shelter up at Dale's place." "Sheriff," Dale stepped forward, producing the deed from his coat. "We've got something that needs official attention." Braddock took the papers with deliberate slowness, studying them through narrowed eyes. The office grew quiet, except for the tick of a wall clock and the crackle of the pot-bellied stove. "This appears to be in order," he said finally, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though there's been considerable discussion lately about water rights in the valley, Railroad's making some compelling arguments about development needs. That deed's legal and proper, Dale stated firmly. Signed by James Morton himself. Braddock leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. I'll need to review the matter carefully. These things take time, you understand? Proper channels. And all that? How much time? Susan asked, her voice steady, despite the tension visible in her shoulders. Hard to say, the sheriff's eyes flickered between them. Meanwhile, I'd advise against stirring up trouble. Railroads got considerable influence these days. The law's the law, Dale reminded him quietly. Whether it wears a fancy suit or ranch clothes, Braddock's expression hardened. That'll be all for now. I'll send word when I've reviewed everything proper-like. Outside the sheriff's office, the afternoon light had taken on a gray cast as new snow began to fall. Susan's shoulders slumped slightly as they descended the steps. He's in their pocket, she whispered. Just like back home. Sheriff ain't the only voice that matters, came a deep, calm voice from nearby. They turned to find a tall man in a preacher's collar watching them. His Cherokee features were weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held both wisdom and kindness. Jonah Beershield, he introduced himself, inclining his head respectfully to Susan. I couldn't help overhearing. The railroad's been pushing hard lately, but they don't own every soul in town. Preacher Dale acknowledged with obvious respect. Mrs. Avery, Jonah continued, my people know something about broken promises and stolen rights, but we also know the power of communities standing together. He smiled gently. Don't lose heart. There are more good folks in this valley than you might think. Susan's eyes brightened with unshed tears. Thank you, Reverend Beershield. The Lord moves in mysterious ways, Jonah replied. Sometimes through legal papers, sometimes through neighbors helping neighbors. He nodded to them both and moved. On his quiet dignity, leaving a lasting impression. Dale helped Susan back into the wagon as the snow began falling harder. The team shifted restlessly, eager to be home before dark. As they left town behind, the gathering storm slowly erased their tracks. But the weight of unseen eyes followed their progress. Susan huddled deeper into her blankets, watching the familiar. Shapes of buildings fade into the swirling white. Dale kept his attention on the darkening trail, aware that their simple act of presenting the deed had set larger forces in motion. Neither spoke as the wagon carried them through the thickening storm, each lost in thoughts of what battles tomorrow might bring. The warmth of the ranch house kitchen couldn't quite chase away the chill that had settled in. Dale's bones during the ride back from town. He stood by the window, watching darkness gather early as the storm clouds thickened overhead. Behind him, the familiar sounds of supper preparation filled the air, the clatter of pots, the snap of kindling being added. To the stove, the soft rustle of Susan's skirts as she moved about his kitchen as if she'd always belonged there. Boss Tom Wheeler, his foreman of 15 years, appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave. Need a word. Dale followed him onto the covered porch, where the wind couldn't carry their voices. Tom shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say. Words already spreading about the railroad trouble. Tom began, his voice low. Cattle buyers down in Denver, they're nervous types. If the syndicate starts leaning on them, he left the rest unsaid. Dale's jaw tightened. You reckon we should turn our backs on what's right to keep them happy? Ain't about right or wrong, boss. It's about survival. Tom pulled his coat closer against the cold. Ranch can't run without buyers. Men can't work without pay. The Lord provides, Dale said firmly, though his heart squeezed at the thought of his men going hungry. We'll find honest buyers. Always have. Tom nodded slowly. Respect and worry warring in his expression. Just wanted you to know what we're facing. He turned to go, then paused. That woman, she's got spirit. I'll give her that. Reminds me some of Miss Sarah way she carries herself. Inside, the kitchen had transformed under Susan's touch. The iron stove radiated heat, and the rich aroma of beef stew filled the air. She'd found Dale's mother's old blue and white bowls, setting them out with care on the worn wooden table. The ranch hands filed in from the bunkhouse, stamping snow from their boots, their initial wariness melting as Susan ladled out generous portions. "Ma'am," young Billy Jenkins said shyly as she handed him a bowl, "this sure smells like home cooking." Susan's smile was warm. "My mother always said a properly seasoned stew could cure most anything that ails you." The men ate with appreciation, and Dale noticed how they sat straighter, used better manners than usual. Susan moved among them with quiet grace, refilling bowls, offering cornbread. The kitchen felt more alive than it had in years. After the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Dale found Susan at the barn door, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. "The mare," she explained. "I heard her coughing earlier." Together, they entered the barn's lantern-lit warmth. In her stall, Dale's favorite mare, Lady, stood with her head lowered, breathing labored. Susan approached slowly, speaking soft words. Of comfort, "Poor thing," she murmured, running gentle hands over the horse's flanks. "The damps got into her joints, I expect. My father's old mare used to suffer the same way. You know horses?" Dale asked, watching how naturally she handled the animal. Susan nodded, her fingers finding the swollen spots with practiced ease. "Grew up on a farm outside Springfield. Wasn't much, but we learned to care for what we had." Her eyes grew distant. After the war, seemed like everything was scarce except hard work. "Mother passed, then father." She straightened her shoulders. "But he taught me well. Every creature deserves kindness," he'd say, "especially when they're hurting." Dale reached for the jar of liniment on the shelf. "Reckon your father was a wise man." He uncorked the bottle, the sharp medicinal smell filling the air. "Here, if you hold her head, I'll show you how we do this." Their hands met briefly as he demonstrated the proper way to work the medicine into Lady's joints. Susan's fingers were strong despite their delicacy, and she quickly caught the rhythm of the treatment. The mare's breathing eased as they worked in comfortable silence. "You've got a good touch," Dale observed. "Lady doesn't usually take to strangers." "Animals know when you mean them well," Susan replied softly. "Just like people, I suppose, though people can be a sight more suspicious." Dale thought of the sheriff's cold eyes, the weight of unseen threats. "Got reason to be these days." "Yes," Susan agreed, her hands still moving steadily over the mare's legs. "But there's still good in the world. Has to be. Or what would be the point of trying?" The quiet certainty in her voice stirred something in Dale's chest. As they finished with the liniment, Susan began to hum softly and old hymn his mother used to sing. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar melody caught him by surprise, and without thinking, he joined in, his deep voice blending with her clear tones. The mare's ears pricked forward at their singing, and the barn seemed to grow warmer somehow, more sheltered from the storm. They ended the hymn together, the last notes fading into comfortable silence. Susan's cheeks were flushed, though whether from the work or something else, Dale couldn't tell. "It's been a long while since I sang that," he admitted. "Sarah loved it too. It always gives me hope," Susan said simply. Even in the darkest times, they settled Lady for the night, making sure she had fresh hay and water. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the barn's weathered boards. Dale insisted on escorting Susan back to the house, though it was only a short walk through the swirling snow in the kitchen. He built up the fire while Susan wrapped herself in the quilt he'd given her. The familiar patterns sewn by Sarah's hands years ago looked right, somehow draped around Susan's shoulders. The house creaked and settled around them, but for the first time in years, it felt like a home again. not just shelter from the storm. Thank you, Susan said suddenly, for everything. I know what it's costing you. Dale looked at her steadily. Some things are worth the cost. The wind howled outside, testing the shutters, but within the ranch house, a fragile peace had taken root. Susan hummed softly as she prepared for sleep, the hymn's melody weaving through the night sounds of the house. Dale sat in his chair by the fire, listening to the familiar yet new sounds of another person sharing his home, and felt something long frozen inside him beginning to thaw. The Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the recent snowfall glittering like scattered diamonds across the valley. Dale hitched his best team to the wagon, their breath steaming in the crisp air. Susan emerged from the house wearing her freshly pressed gray dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. She'd spent an hour working on the garment the night before, determined to appear respectable despite her circumstances. Mighty fine morning for a revival, Dale said, helping her onto the wagon seat. The leather creaked as he settled beside her, taking up the reins with practiced hands. I confess I'm nervous, Susan admitted softly as they started down the snow-packed road. It's been so long since I've been to a proper service. Dale nodded, understanding in his eyes. Jonah Beershield's got a way of making folks feel welcome, no matter their troubles. The small clapboard church stood on the outskirts of town, its white-painted walls gleaming in the morning sun. Already, wagons and horses clustered around it like faithful sheep around their shepherd. Cherokee families in their Sunday best mingled, with settlers greeting each other with quiet dignity. The sight of different peoples gathered in peace warmed Susan's heart. As Dale helped her down from the wagon, heads turned. Whispers rustled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Susan felt her cheeks warm, but Dale's steady presence beside her gave her courage. They made their way up the wooden steps, boots and shoes thumping against the planks. Inside, sunlight streamed through simple glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across worn wooden pews. The pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated welcome. Heat. Susan breathed in the familiar sense of beeswax candles and well-oiled wood. Memories of peaceful Sundays past washing over her. They found seats near the middle, where Dale's height wouldn't block anyone's view. More people filed in, weather-beaten ranchers, shopkeepers in their good coats, women with children in tow. Susan recognized faces from town, some who'd turned away when she'd visited the sheriff's office. Now they offered cautious nods, their curiosity evident. A hush fell as Jonah Beershield stepped to the pulpit. The Cherokee preacher's deep-set eyes held wisdom earned through years of bridging worlds. His black coat was well-worn but dignified, like the man himself. Brothers and sisters, he began, his rich voice filling the space. We gather today as children of one Creator, who made this good land for all to share in peace. Susan felt herself lean forward, drawn by the quiet authority in his words. Beside her, Dale sat equally intent, his usual stoic expression softening. The good book speaks much of justice, Jonah continued, not as a weapon to strike down enemies, but as living water to nourish all who thirst. His gaze swept the congregation. When we see our neighbor suffering wrong, we cannot turn away and call ourselves faithful. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the church. Susan's hands clasped tightly in her lap as Jonah spoke of duty to community, of standing together against those who would take by force what belonged to all. The creek that runs through our valley, he said, was put there by the Creator's hand, not to enrich the powerful, but to sustain life for all his creatures. His words seemed to strike directly at the heart of their situation, though he named no names, as the sermon drew to a close. Jonah called for those seeking prayer to approach the altar rail. Susan felt Dale's questioning glance. Drawing a deep breath, she stood. After a moment's hesitation, Dale rose beside her. They weren't alone. Other families moved forwards, mall ranchers whose lands bordered the creek, mothers who worried about water for their gardens. At the rail, Susan knelt, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. Dale's solid presence remained at her shoulder. Jonah moved among them, offering prayers. When he reached Susan, he laid a gentle hand on her head. "Sister," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "you hold a trust for this valley's future. The water rights in your keeping are not just paper, but hope for many." Tears pricked Susan's eyes as the preacher continued. "May the Creator grant you wisdom and courage for this burden, and may He send good neighbors to stand with you in truth. You won't stand alone." Dale's deep voice rang out, steady and clear. "This ranch and this rancher will see justice done." Susan looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, seeing the same resolution she'd witnessed when he'd faced down the deputy. But now that private commitment had become public testimony, witnessed by the whole community as they returned to their seats. Something had shifted in the church's atmosphere. Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, reached out to squeeze Susan's hand as she passed. Old Jim Tucker, who ran the livery stable, gave Dale a firm nod of approval. The service concluded with a hymn, "Shall We Gather at the River?" The familiar melody swelled through the rafters, voices joining in harmony. Susan sang with all her heart, Dale's deep bass rumbling beside her. Through the windows, she could see snowflakes beginning to drift down again. Dancing in the sunlight, after the final amen, people lingered, drawn together by something stronger than the cold outside. Mrs. Peterson approached with a covered dish. "For your supper," she said warmly to Susan, "my mother's chicken and dumplings recipe." Others followed suit. Martha Jenkins brought a jar of preserved peaches. The Williams sisters offered a loaf of fresh baked bread. Each small gift carried the same message: you are not alone. "We've got water rights too," Tom Whitaker, a small rancher, told Dale. "Railroad can't run roughshod over all of us." "My boys can help with fence mending," offered William Gray, another neighbor. "Reckon we all need to watch each other's backs." Now, Susan stood amazed as more folks came forward, each offering what they could: labor, food, prayers, friendship. The support she'd longed for but never dared expect was materializing before her eyes. Jonah. Beershield approached as the crowd began to thin. "The Creator works in His own time," he said, smiling at Susan's tear-stained cheeks. "Sometimes He uses storms to bring people together." "Thank you," Susan whispered, her heart too full for more words. The preacher turned to Dale. "You've chosen a hard path, brother, but a righteous one." "Ain't about choosing," Dale replied simply. "It's about doing what needs doing." Outside, the snow fell steadily now, dusting hats and shoulders as people headed to their wagons. Dale helped Susan up to their seat, tucking a blanket around her with care. The gifts from their neighbors filled a basket at their feet, visible symbols of invisible bonds growing stronger as they drove home through the swirling snow. Susan felt warmed by more than just the blanket. The morning's hymn still echoed in her mind, and she found herself humming softly. Dale glanced at her, a rare smile touching his lips, and added his voice to hers. The ranch house appeared through the curtain of snow, its windows glowing with welcome. For the first time since her world had crumbled, Susan felt truly anchored, not just by Dale's protection or the deed in her possession, but by the web of community that had begun to weave itself around her today. She was no longer a desperate widow seeking shelter. She had become part of something larger, something worth fighting for. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow as Dale and Susan made their way home from the revival meeting. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white landscape, turning everything to silver and blue. They passed the Hendersons' place first, where brown winter grass poked through thin patches of snow. Their cattle clustered near a half-frozen stream, pawing at ice for water. "Times are hard all over," Dale said quietly, nodding toward the scrawny herd. Railroad's been damming up streams, saying they need the water for their engines. Folks, downstream, get what's left. Susan pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Sarah Henderson brought me eggs last market day. Said they lost 3 calves last month from bad water. They passed more homesteads, some showing signs of life. Others eerily quiet. Outside the Miller place, young Tommy waved from where he was chopping wood. His mother came to the door and raised her hand in greeting, a dish towel clutched in the other. Reckon word's spreading about your deed, Dale said. People are taking heart, but not everyone welcomed their passing. At the Carson Ranch, the old man turned his back when they approached, hustling his grandchildren inside. The closed door spoke volumes about fear. Can't blame them, Susan sighed. Railroad's got long arms. Tail's jaw tightened. Too long. Been reaching where they got no right. Back at the ranch, the day's warmth was already fading. Dale helped Susan down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist. She noticed his touch lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary, and something fluttered in her chest. Got something to show you, he said, leading her toward the barn. Figure it's time you learned more about running fence lines. Inside, the barn was warm with animal heat. Dale's horses nickered softly in greeting. He stopped at a stall housing. A dappled mare, gentler looking than his own mount. This here's Maple, he said, running a hand down her nose. Used to be Sarah's my wife's. Haven't had the heart to sell her. Reckon she could use some exercise. Susan's eyes widened. You mean time you learned to ride proper? Dale's eyes crinkled at the corners. Can't have you dependent on wagons? If trouble comes, he showed her how to saddle up, his hands guiding hers over buckles and straps. The leather was butter soft with age, well oiled and cared for. Susan's fingers trembled slightly as she tightened the cinch. She won't bite, Dale assured her, helping her mount. Just keep your back straight and your hands steady. Susan gripped the reins tightly, feeling impossibly high off the ground. But Maple stood patient as a church pew, waiting for direction. Dale swung up onto his own horse, making it look easy as breathing. Follow my lead, he said. We'll take it slow. Hey. Rode out along the fence line, Dale pointing out markers and explaining how to check for damage. Susan began to relax as Maple's steady gait found its rhythm. The mare seemed to sense her nervousness, picking her steps carefully through the snow. There you go, Dale called encouragingly. You're a natural. A laugh bubbled up from Susan's chest, surprising them both. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that, free and unguarded. Dale's answering smile transformed his weathered face. Years falling away, they reached the line shack as the sun began to sink. Dale helped her dismount, her legs wobbling slightly. Inside the simple shelter, he got a fire going while Susan rapped, her fingers around a tin cup of coffee. Through the window, they watched deer emerge from the tree line, moving like shadows across the snow. Their breath fogged the glass as they stood close together, sharing the warmth of the small space. Thank you, Susan said softly, for teaching me, for everything. Dale's hand found hers, rough palm against smooth. Ain't nothing to thank me for. The moments stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Susan felt her heart beating quick and light, like a bird's wings. Dale's thumb traced small circles on her wrist, and she leaned slightly closer to his solid presence. The spell broke at the sound of hooves approaching. Dale stepped to the door, hand dropping to his hip where his pistol rode. But it was just young Billy from the general store, riding hard through the gathering dusk. Mr. McCord. The boy's voice carried sharp with urgency. Pa sent me to warn you. Syndicate men in town, whole bunch of them. Holed up in the saloon since noon, drinking and talking mean. Dale's expression hardened. Much obliged for the warning, Billy. You get on home now, before dark catches you." They watched the boy. Right away, his horse's hooves kicking up snow. The peaceful mood of moments before had shattered like ice. "We should head back," Dale said quietly. Storms coming anyway. The ride home was tenser, both of them watching the shadows. At the ranch house, lamplight spilled welcome from the windows. But as they stored their saddles, another rider approached this. One headed toward town. "Sharif's man," Dale muttered, recognizing the silhouette. The messenger carried himself stiffly, like a man bearing bad news. Susan's hand found Dale's arm. "What do you reckon they're planning?" "Nothing good." He covered her hand with his own. "But we'll face it together. Whole Valley's with us now." They watched until the rider disappeared into the growing darkness. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But for now, they had this moment standing close in the barn's warmth, while outside the wind began to rise. Morning sunlight streamed through the sheriff's office window, catching dust motes in its golden beam. Sheriff Braddock hunched over his desk, frowning at the telegram that had just arrived. His weathered fingers smoothed the yellow paper as he read it again, each word hitting like a hammer blow. The message was clear. The territorial governor himself had signed off on a new deed giving the railroad syndicate full rights to Cedar Creek. The paper bore the official seal there would be no arguing against it. Outside, the town stirred to life. Wagons creaked down Main Street, and shop owners swept their boardwalks. But inside the office, Braddock sat motionless, the telegram heavy in his hands. He knew what was coming. There would be trouble by noon. The news had spread through town, like a prairie fire. Folks gathered in clusters outside the general store, voices hushed but urgent. Some cast worried glances toward the saloon where the syndicate men lounged on the porch, triumph written plain on their faces. Dale and Susan rode in around 2 o'clock, their horses' hooves raising puffs of dust from the hard-packed street. Susan sat straight in her saddle, chin held high, though her hands gripped the reins too tight. Dale's expression was carved from stone. "Look who's come to town," someone called out mockingly. The widow and her protector. Laughter rippled from the saloon porch. The syndicate men didn't bother to hide their sneers. "Best run along home, McCord," one of them drawled. "This fight's already lost." Dale ignored them, helping Susan down from her horse. Together they climbed the steps to the sheriff's office, boots hollow on the wooden planks. Inside, Braddock looked up from his desk, his face giving nothing away. "Heard you got some news, Sheriff," Dale said quietly. Braddock nodded, pulling out an official-looking document. New deed came in this morning, signed by the territorial governor himself. He spread it on the desk, pointing to the red wax seal at the bottom. "Gives full water rights to the railroad company. I'm sorry, but there's no getting around this." Susan stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "That's not possible. My husband's deed ain't worth the paper it's written on now." Braddock cut in. "Governor's seal overrides any previous claims." "That's the law." Dale's hands curled into fists. "Law or railroad money talking." "Watch yourself, McCord," Braddock warned. "I'm still the law in this town. You're nothing but a railroad puppet." Dale shot back. "Where's your backbone, Sheriff? You know this ain't right." Braddock's face darkened. "That's enough. One more word, and I'll have you in jail for contempt." "Contempt?" Dale barked out a harsh laugh. "I'll show you contempt. This whole thing stinks of corruption, and you know it." "Dale, please," Susan whispered, touching his arm. But he was too far gone now, rage burning hot in his eyes. "You're supposed to protect people," Dale continued, voice rising. "Instead, you're helping thieves steal what little water folks have left. How do you sleep at night? That's it." Braddock stood, chair scraping back. Jenkins, Carter, Cott, get in here and take McCord to a cell. 2 deputies burst through the door, grabbing Dale's arms. He struggled as they dragged him toward the jail section, boots scraping on the floor. Dale, Susan cried out, starting after him. Stay back, Mrs. Avery, Braddock warned, unless you want to join him. Susan froze, watching helplessly as the deputies wrestled Dale into a cell. The iron door clanged shut with horrible finality. Get out, Braddock told her. And tell the rest of your supporters this is settled. The creek belongs to the railroad. Now, anyone interferes, they'll end up right next to McCord. Susan stumbled out into the street, blinking in the harsh sunlight. Faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, others coldly satisfied. She had never felt more alone. A gentle hand touched her shoulder. I'll go yell. She turned to find Jonah Beershield standing there, his dark eyes kind but determined. Come, he said softly, leading her away from the curious stares. In the shade of the church, he spoke again. This fight isn't over, sister. The Creator sees truth, even when men try to bury it. But what can we do? Susan whispered. They have the governor's seal now. Paper seals can be bought, Jonah said. But right and wrong are written on the heart. The people know what's true. We must have faith and stand together. His words offered little comfort as Susan rode back to Dale's ranch alone. The house felt enormous and empty without him. As night fell, she built up the fire and sat in her usual chair, staring at Dale's empty seat across the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, but they couldn't chase away the cold despair that had settled in her chest. She thought of Dale in his cell, probably pacing like a caged mountain lion. Would he be warm enough? Had anyone brought him supper? The questions gnawed at her like hungry wolves. Outside, a coyote called mournfully into the darkness. Susan pulled Dale's wife's quilt tighter around her shoulders, fighting back tears. Everything they had built over these past weeks, the trust, the warmth, the fragile hope of something more now seemed as insubstantial as smoke. Sleep was impossible. She kept seeing Dale's face as they dragged him away, hearing the awful sound of that cell door closing. Somewhere in town, the syndicate men were probably celebrating their victory, while good people like the Hendersons and Millers worried about how they would water their stock come spring. The empty chair across from her stood like an accusation. She had brought this trouble to Dale's door. If not for her, he would be free tonight, safe in his own home. The thought carved fresh wounds in her heart. Susan stared into the dying fire, despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had never felt more alone or more afraid. Not even that snowy morning when she had knelt on Dale's porch, begging for mercy. Had she felt this helpless? The flames flickered lower, casting weird shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called a Gina, lost and lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in her soul. The next morning arrived, wrapped in gray clouds, matching Susan's heavy heart. She stood at Dale's kitchen window, watching frost melt off the fence rails. The house felt too quiet without his steady presence. A knock at the back door made her jump. Tom Wilson, Dale's foreman, stood there shifting from foot to foot. "Ma'am," he said, hat in hand. "The boys and me will handle the morning feed, but there's decisions need making. About the cattle in the north pasture." Susan nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Show me what needs doing, Tom." Outside, the February wind cut through her shawl as she followed Tom to the barn. The other hands tipped their hats, faces uncertain. They were good men, but she saw the doubt in their eyes. Could a widow who'd shown up half-frozen on their doorstep handle running a ranch? She helped them load hay into the wagon, her hands growing raw from the rough twine. Every task reminded her of Dale's absence, the empty coffee cup by his chair, his saddle hanging unused on its peg. By mid-morning, her back ached from hefting feed sacks, but Susan pressed on. Dale had risked everything to protect her. She wouldn't let his ranch fall apart while he sat in jail. "Reckon I'd better ride into town," she told Tom around noon. "Need to check on Mr. McCord." The foreman nodded gravely. "Want one of us to escort you, ma'am?" "No," Susan said. "Best if I go alone. Less likely to cause trouble that way." She rode Dale's gentle bay mare into town, her heart beating faster as she approached the jail. The street was quiet to quiet. Folks hurried past with averted eyes, no one wanting to be seen speaking to her. Deputy Jenkins blocked the jailhouse door, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Sheriff says no visitors." "Please," Susan said. "I just need to know he's—" "All right, he's fine. Now move along before there's trouble." Through the barred window, she caught a glimpse of Dale pacing his cell like a caged wolf. Her throat tightened. He looked up, their eyes meeting briefly before Jenkins stepped between them. "I said move along, Mrs. Avery." Fighting tears, Susan turned the mare toward home. The ride back seemed endless, each hoof beat echoing her failure. She had promised herself she'd be strong, but seeing Dale imprisoned because of her made her courage crumbled at the ranch. She went through the motions of evening chores mechanically. The hands had already headed to the bunkhouse when she finally stepped back inside the empty house. Susan sank into her chair by the cold hearth, Dale's absence a physical ache in her chest. The words rose unbidden to her lips, just as they had that desperate morning on Dale's porch. "Please, just make it quick." But this time, she wasn't begging for an end to her misery. This was a prayer whispered into the gathering darkness, a plea for strength, for courage to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. She was still sitting there when hoofbeats sounded outside. Her heart leaped, hoping against hope, but no, it was Jonah Beershield's familiar figure that appeared in the doorway. "Sister," he said gently, "may I come in?" Susan nodded, quickly wiping her eyes. Of course, Reverend Jonah carried a leather satchel, which he set carefully on Dale's desk. "I've been speaking with the tribal elders," he said, pulling out yellowed maps and documents. "There's something you need to see." He spread the papers across the desk, carefully preserved treaties, survey maps with flowing creek lines marked in faded ink. Susan leaned closer, trying to make sense of the spidery handwriting. "These are the original territorial surveys," Jonah explained, his finger tracing a blue line. "See here?" Cedar Creek and all its tributaries were designated as shared water rights between settlers and Cherokee families. The railroads claim that they bought exclusive rights from the governor. It goes against treaties signed 40 years ago. Hope flickered in Susan's chest like a tiny flame. But will it be enough? They have the governor's seal now. The governor can't sell what was never his to sell. Jonah's voice held quiet conviction. These treaties were ratified by Congress. They supersede any territorial claims. He pulled out another document, this one bearing multiple wax seals. And here's the original water compact, signed by both tribal leaders and territorial authorities. It specifically prohibits any single entity from claiming exclusive rights to Cedar Creek. Susan's hands trembled as she touched the fragile paper. This could change everything. "It won't be easy," Jonah cautioned. "The railroad has money and influence. Truth has its own power, sister. We just have to be brave enough to stand for it." Susan straightened, feeling strength flow back into her spine. She had been foolish to let despair overwhelm her. Dale hadn't given up when she arrived desperate on his doorstep. He hadn't backed down when the sheriff threatened him. She wouldn't give up now. "What do we do first?" she asked. "We gather support," Jonah said. small ranchers, Cherokee families, everyone who depends on the creek. Show them these documents. Help them understand what's at stake. Susan nodded, already planning. Tom Wilsondale's foreman. He knows every rancher in the valley. And Mrs. Henderson at the general store. People listened to her. Good. Jonah smiled approvingly. We'll need a meeting place, somewhere the syndicate men won't expect. The old mission chapel, Susan suggested. It's far enough from town, and your people still use it sometimes, don't they? Perfect. I'll send word through the usual channels. Day after tomorrow, at sunset. Yes. Susan's voice grew stronger. Yes, that will work. After Jonah left, Susan built up the fire, its warmth chasing away the last shadows of despair. She spread the documents across Dale's desk, studying them by lamplight. Each page reinforced her determination. The railroad thought they had won. They believed that with Dale in jail and their governor's deed in hand, Susan would crumble. Instead, she felt steel entering her soul. Dale had protected her when she was weak. Now she would fight for him, for the creek, for everyone who depended on its life-giving water. She might be a widow who had arrived with nothing but a tattered shawl and a desperate plea. But she was done begging for mercy. It was time to stand and fight. The abandoned trading post sat at the edge of Cherokee territory, its weathered walls holding memories of deals, both fair and false. As evening approached, riders emerged from different directions, weathered faces beneath wide-brimmed hats, wrapped in blankets against the chill. They dismounted quietly, tethering horses to the old hitching rail. Inside, Jonah Beershield had cleared the dusty counter, spreading maps across its scarred surface. Lanterns cast pools of yellow light as elders gathered Cherokee leaders in their traditional ribbon shirts. Mexican ranchers with silver concos glinting on their vests. Settler families who had worked the land for decades. Welcome, friends, Jonah said, his deep voice filling the space. We gather tonight because truth must stand against power. Susan sat near the wall, watching faces illuminated by lamplight. She recognized Miguel Ortiz, whose family had ranched in the valley since Spanish times. Beside him, Sarah Walking Stick. Her silver hair tied back with a beaded band represented the Cherokee Council. Thomas Baker, who had helped survey the original territorial boundaries, stood examining the maps with knowing eyes. These waters, Jonah began, touching the blue. Lines marking Cedar Creek were never meant for one man's profit. Our grandfathers understood this. He lifted the first treaty document carefully. In 1838, when the boundaries were drawn, both Cherokee and settler leaders insisted on shared access. The creek gives life to all. Sarah Walking Stick nodded slowly. I remember my father speaking of those meetings. They lasted many days until all agreed. Si es verdad, Miguel added. My grandfather told similar stories. The water rights were sacred to all. Thomas Baker stepped forward, squinting at the survey marks. I helped chart these lines myself 30 years ago. The agreements were clear no single party could claim exclusive control. Susan listened intently as each elder shared their knowledge. Stories emerged of handshake deals honored through droughts and floods, of neighbors helping neighbors regardless of background. The railroad's attempt to seize control struck at the heart of this carefully woven piece. But will the sheriff listen? Someone asked. The railroad has the governor's seal now. Jonah raised the congressional ratification document. This carries more weight than any governor's mark. These treaties were confirmed by federal law. And look here. Thomas Baker pointed to fine print along the creek's course. The original survey specifically protected shared access. They can't. Just erase that history. Sarah Walking Stick's eyes flashed. They tried to erase our history before. We're still here. Susan stood, her voice steady. The railroad thinks they can divide us. but this creek binds our lives together, just as it always has." Heads nodded around the room. Miguel Ortiz spoke up. "My cattle drink from the same waters as Thomas's sheep and Sarah's horses. God made this creek for all of us." As night deepened, they formed plans. Thomas would speak to other surveyors who remembered the original boundaries. Sarah would rally Cherokee families whose livelihoods depended on the creek. Miguel would gather Mexican ranchers who held old Spanish water rights. "We'll meet at the Mission Chapel," Jonah announced, "day after tomorrow at sunset. Bring anyone who values truth over railroad gold." Meanwhile, across town, Dale McCord paced his cell. 8 steps forward, 8 steps back. The jail's silence pressed in, broken only by the deputy's boot heels on wooden floors. Heavy footsteps approached. Dale turned to see 2 well-dressed men outside his cell, railroad agents, their suits dusty from travel. "Mr. McCord," the taller one said smoothly, "we've come to offer you a sensible way out of this unfortunate situation." Dale said nothing, watching them with steady eyes. "Your ranch is well respected," the man continued. "The syndicate could use a man like you. Sign a statement supporting our claim to the creek, and all charges disappear. We'll even throw in guaranteed water rights for your property and Mrs. Avery." Dale's voice was quiet but firm. The shorter agent shrugged. "The widow made her choice. But why should you suffer for her stubbornness?" Dale turned away, resuming his pacing. 8 steps forward, 8 steps back. "Think carefully, McCord," the tall man called through the bars. "Cross us, and you'll lose everything. That ranch you've worked so hard to build, gone. Your good name in the territory, ruined." Their footsteps faded, leaving Dale alone with their threats echoing in his mind. He sank onto the thin mattress, closing his eyes. Susan's voice came to him, singing that hymn in his kitchen. The memory warmed him like sunlight. Kneeling on the cold floor, Dale pressed his forehead against rough-hewn bars. Words of scripture rose to his lips, verses his mother had taught him long ago. "Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart." The jail grew quiet, except for the deputy's snores. Dale remained kneeling, prayers flowing like water. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Across town, in the trading post's lamplight, Susan and Jonah bent over the maps one final time. Her finger traced Cedar Creek's winding course, seeing not just blue lines, but the lives connected to its flow. Dale's cattle, Sarah's horses, Miguel's crops, Cherokee children swimming in summer pools. "We'll need God's help," Jonah said softly. Susan nodded, remembering Dale's strength. When he first took her in, "He's been with us this far." One by one, the elders departed into darkness, carrying hope with them like hidden flame. Tomorrow, they would spread the word to small ranches and Cherokee homes, to Mexican families and settler cabins. A creek's song belonged to all of them. In his cell, Dale whispered another verse. "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help." The parallel prayers rose like twin streams joining the greater flow of justice. Dawn would bring new challenges, but tonight, faith and determination ran deep as the creek itself. The courthouse loomed against the morning sky, its wooden steps already crowded with townsfolk by 10 o'clock. Wind whistled through the street, carrying dust and whispers as people gathered. Some clutched coffee cups against the chill, while others huddled in small groups, voices low and urgent. Susan stood at the bottom of the steps, her worn leather folder pressed against her chest. Jonah Beershield waited beside her, his presence steady as stone. Behind them, Sarah Walkingstick and Miguel Ortiz conferred quietly with other elders, who had studied the maps the night before. The courthouse doors swung wide. 3 syndicate men strode out onto the porch, their suits crisp despite the dusty wind. Behind them lounged 4 armed guards, rifles held with casual menace. The lead agent, a tall man with cold eyes, surveyed the crowd like a rancher counting cattle. Quite a turnout, he drawled, adjusting his silk vest. Though I don't see why. The matter's already settled. Susan's fingers tightened on her folder. Jonah touched her elbow gently, steadying her as they climbed the steps. The guards shifted, hands moving to their weapons, but the agent waved them. Back with a smirk. Inside, the courthouse filled quickly. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of ranchers and townspeople. Cherokee families sat together near the front, their faces set with quiet determination. The syndicate men claimed the first row, spreading papers across the rail with proprietary confidence. Sheriff Braddock entered from his office, looking tired and drawn. He adjusted his badge, eyes skittering away from Susan's direct gaze. The room fell silent as he took his seat behind the massive oak desk. This hearing, he began, voice rough, concerns water rights along Cedar Creek. The railroad syndicate has presented a deed bearing the territorial governor's seal, if I may. Sheriff. Jonah's deep voice filled the room. He stepped forward. Head high. There are older claims that must be heard. Braddock frowned. This isn't a proper court, Reverend. We're just here to review the governor's ruling. Truth deserves a hearing, Jonah replied firmly. Or have we abandoned that principle in this territory? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, then nodded curtly. Make it quick. A door opened at the back of the room. Dale McCord entered, flanked by deputies. His face was drawn from days in jail, but his eyes found Susan's immediately. She straightened, drawing strength from his unwavering gaze. First, Jonah announced, Mrs. Susan Avery holds a legal deed. Signed and witnessed, granting water rights to her late husband and his heirs. The syndicate's lead agent stood. A worthless paper, superseded by the governor's authority. Let her present it, someone called from the crowd. Let's see both deeds. Susan stepped forward, unfolding her documents with trembling fingers. My husband obtained these rights legally, before any railroad claim existed. She held up the deed. Its official seals clearly visible. The dates and witnesses are all recorded properly. This creek water was meant to serve the whole valley, not just railroad interests. Gasps and whispers filled the room as the paper was passed forward. Sheriff Braddock examined it, brow furrowed. These signatures appear genuine, he admitted. Reluctantly, the syndicate agent snorted. Ancient history. The governor's new deed overrides all previous claims. Does it? Jonah moved to the center of the room. Friends, what I hold here proves otherwise. He spread the treaty maps across. The sheriff's desk. Sarah Walkingstick and Miguel Ortiz stepped up beside him, their presence lending weight to the moment. These maps and documents show the original boundaries established in 1838, Jonah explained. They were ratified by Congress and signed by territorial authorities. Look here. He pointed to careful markings along the creeks. Of course, Cedar Creek was specifically designated as shared water. No single entity could claim exclusive control. The syndicate agent's face darkened. Those old Indian treaties don't matter now. They matter to federal law. Thomas Baker spoke up from the crowd. I helped survey those lines myself. The agreements were binding. Sarah Walkingstick's voice rang out. Our people have honored these boundaries for generations. The creek gives life to all Cherokee, Mexican, settler alike. No man can own flowing water. The courthouse erupted in argument. Ranchers stood, shouting about water rights. Cherokee families called out in their own language, gesturing at the maps. The syndicate's guards gripped their rifles tighter, eyes darting between their employers and the agitated crowd. Order. Sheriff Braddock slammed his gavel. Order in this hearing. But the tide of voices rolled on. Miguel Ortiz waved old Spanish water grants. Thomas Baker quoted survey regulations. Farmers described generations of shared access to the creek. Dale stood silent by the deputies. Watching Susan, she met his eyes across the chaos, and a moment of perfect understanding passed between them. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about justice, about community, about standing together against those who would divide and conquer. These people are threatening legal authority. The syndicate agent's voice rose above the din. Sheriff, restore order. Braddock banged his gavel again, the sharp crack echoing off wooden walls. Quiet, all of you. But the room had shifted. Neighbors who had watched each other warily now stood shoulder to shoulder. Cherokee elders and settler ranchers bent together. Over the maps, pointing out familiar landmarks. Mexican families shared their own documents. Adding to the weight of evidence, the syndicate men huddled together, whispered urgently. Their confident swagger had vanished, replaced by darting glances and nervous adjustments of fancy neckties. Sheriff Susan's clear voice cut through the clamor. Will you uphold the law? The real law, not just what powerful men decree. Braddock stared at the pile of documents before him. Sassoon's deed. The treaty maps, the Spanish grants, all challenging the railroad's sleek new paper with its governor's seal. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the morning chill. The courthouse hummed. With tension, every eye fixed on the sheriff as he struggled visibly with his conscience. The syndicate agent stepped forward, mouth opening to speak. But Braddock raised his hand. I've seen enough, he said heavily. These older claims, they have merit. They need proper review. This is outrageous. The syndicate agent slammed, his fist on the rail. The governor will hear about this defiance. Let him hear, Jonah replied calmly. Truth fears no authority. The crowd surged forward, voices rising again. Sheriff Braddock's gavel cracked uselessly against the wave of sound. The syndicate men gathered their papers, faces dark with fury. Their armed guards looked increasingly uncertain, overwhelmed by the press of bodies and the force of united conviction. Through it all, Dale stood unmoved, his eyes never leaving Susan. She clutched her folder of precious papers, heart pounding with hope and fear as the courthouse erupted around them. The moment balanced on a knife's edge justice and greed, community and corruption. Locked in a contest as old as the territory itself, the sheriff's gavel fell one final time. Lost in the thunder of voices raised in argument and acclaim. The tide had turned, but where it would carry them remained to be seen. Chaos exploded in the courthouse. Two syndicate enforcers lunged for Susan's papers, but the crowd surged forward like a breaking dam. Ranchers threw punches, women brandished. Hatpins and miners pressed in with calloused fists raised. Wooden benches splintered under falling bodies. Protect the documents. Someone shouted as Dale burst free from his guards. He wrapped himself around Susan, shielding her from the mayhem. Her papers crumpled against his chest as she clung to him. Be still and know that I am God. Jonah's voice boomed above the fracas, steady as thunder. His words cut through the chaos, stilling raised fists. Judge Braddock, hemmed in by angry faces, wiped his brow. The railroad's deed appears fraudulent, he declared shakily. All claims suspended pending review. The syndicate men slunk away, muttering threats. Susan buried her face in Dale's shoulder, tears soaking his shirt. Together, they walked into piercing winter sunshine as the courthouse doors swung wide. Around them, the townspeople moved as one body, united at last. In the peaceful days that followed, Dale and Susan rode side by side across the valley, their horses' hooves crunching through melting snow. At each homestead, they promised fair water rights to grateful neighbors. "The creek's blessing belongs to all," Susan would say, her voice warm and sure. Settlers arrived daily at the ranch, arms laden with gifts. Mrs. Peterson brought fresh-baked bread and quilting squares. The Hendersons led to spotted calves, their bells tinkling. Even the Cherokee families shared dried herbs and smoked venison. In the kitchen, Susan helped old Martha prepare a feast. The cook stove radiated warmth as women chatted and children snuck cookie scraps. Laughter echoed through rooms that had known too much silence. That evening, Dale led Susan onto the starlit porch. Taking her work-roughened hand in his, he spoke. Softly, "Your strength gave me mine back." Susan's eyes glistened. "I never thought I'd find home again." He drew her close, their embrace gentle under the vast Colorado sky. Spring painted the valley in fresh greens and golds. Mountain snowmalt filled the creek with sparkling life as townsfolk gathered at the weathered church. Inside, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, making Susan's white dress glow. Jonah. Beershield stood before the altar, his voice strong and clear. "Love, like water, gives life to all it touches," he said. Smiling at the couple before him, Dale and Susan joined hands, their voices steady with promise. The congregation lifted, their voices in amazing grace, the hymn rolling across the awakening land. Little Mary Peterson scattered wild violets while her grandmother wiped happy tears. After the ceremony, tables groaned with dishes brought by every family in the valley. Cherokee fry bread sat beside settler corn pudding. Laughter and music filled the afternoon air as golden sunset painted the sky. Dale led Susan up their porch steps. She paused at the threshold, eyes twinkling. "Please, just make it quick," she teased. Dale swept her into his arms, carrying her across into their shared tomorrow. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. Be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.